Bonjour à tous, bienvenue dans la...
Good afternoon and welcome to the 32nd section of this Rencontre économique. I am Anne Green, a journalist at the Figaro Economy. I'm going to moderate this session with Akiko Eisenman. We're going to talk about the definition of priority infrastructures. The health crisis has caused new needs to emerge, a need for proximity, acceleration of the energy transition. There's a long list of projects, but despite the recovery plans, the means aren't unlimited. To define these priority projects together, we have a panel with 5 specialists who are all very familiar with the subject from different points of view. First of all, remotely from Lisbon, we have Antonio Costa Silva from the Partex Oil and Gas Group. Next to me, we have Tai Palong from Boston Consteam, Annie Monteau-Giton, Marie-Ange Debon, and Thierry Dau from Meridian. Before we hand over to them, I'll hand over first of all to my teammate Akiko Eisenman from the Cercle des Économistes, who's going to give us a framework for our discussion. Hello, good afternoon everybody. Public investment in France represents 100 billion euros per year, 4% of the GDP. This is more than Germany and more than the average of European Union countries. The French recovery plan of 100 billion euros puts the emphasis on investment, whereas Germany, in its recovery plan, emphasizes the importance of consumption. In the US, the infrastructure plan that has just been accepted by both chambers is about 1 trillion euros. And this is added to the 1.6 trillion euros voted in March for households in the US. So at the moment we are at a historic point. At last, the states are investing hugely to help households and enterprises with investment funds. The sums are absolutely huge. This is an unprecedented opportunity. But there are also risks. How do we use these risks in the right way to resist the temptation to always do more and to avoid creating white elephants? These wonderful animals, they're ridden by the Indian Maharajas, very beautiful but completely useless and pointless. And the equivalent might be the motorways that were built that are completely empty, that are never used, or these domestic bridges that carry very, very small roads. Okay, it's very well building the infrastructures for tomorrow, but what is the point and who are they for? Let me present 4 points. The first aim would be to invest in infrastructures to help the economy recover. But with investment in economy, jobs and the economy is much slower than investment in consumption. In the long term in the emergency situation becomes very pressing. We have to launch the ecological transition. In France, transport produces 13% of greenhouse gas emissions, more than industry. Agriculture represents 19%. 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. Half of that is due to bovines, and this is more than energy, which is 11%. Private vehicles pollute more than other modes of transport, including heavy goods vehicles. So to keep to the Paris Climate Agreement, we have to make an effort equivalent to the first lockdown, but continuing for 30 years, which nobody wants to do, of course. The recovery plan meets this challenge by developing greener transport, cycling and recharging points for electric vehicles, public transport, rail, in particular transport, and waterway transport. The third point is that to prepare for the infrastructures of tomorrow, we shouldn't always do more, shouldn't always increase the offering, we also have to look at the demand. The coming year, the year that we've just been through with the pandemic, pushes us to reconsider the way we look at things. The lockdown has highlighted the important role of workers in the front line who had to do their job and were often a long way away from the urban centres because of the lack of affordable housing. They had to get in their car because of a lack of public transport. For these workers in the front line, For example, if they're not able to use public transport for free, we have to use other public transport systems or have them housed closer to their place of work. Last year, purchasing on internet increased considerably. Amazon France is intending to deliver 400 million packets. In August, working from home will enable those who can do so to move away from the urban centres, although they will occasionally go to the office. So the aim is to think about land use planning by adapting to the demand which has been revealed by COVID, and also to have in mind social justice. You have to give us a good example. How can we adapt infrastructures to the needs of poorer households? Thank you very much, Kiko. Thank you for this scope that you've defined. I'll return now to our first speaker, just for organization. You can ask questions, of course. Once our 5 panelists are each going to say something, they're going to listen to each other and have a debate amongst themselves. During the debate, you can ask your questions either on internet, using your tablet or laptop, or directly in the room. So we'll start with your presentations. So we'll start with my neighbor, David Parlong. You've worked for one of the world leaders in maritime transport, CMO-CGC, before doing PCB, where you're an associate. Before that conversion, you're working at the Financial Ministry of Finance in France with Emmanuel Macron. So we're going to start the roundtable with you to ask you this rather academic question you might be able to answer, which is that infrastructures have always been considered as one of France's assets. Is that still the case after this crisis? Thank you, Anne. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. Before we look at the infrastructures in France, I would like to define 3 criteria to assess French infrastructure. The first is the quality of the service provided to users. An infrastructure is always a facility or an installation which is shared by a group of economic actors. The first point is to make sure that the service fulfills the needs of users. The second criterion is the acceleration as a facilitator of transition. The infrastructures are not just there to meet a need today, they're also there to support the transition of their users. These might be infrastructures to develop green mobility or infrastructures in the area of internet, which make it possible for companies to digitalize. The third criterion to assess the quality of infrastructure is its resilience. By definition, an infrastructure is used by many different people and players. It can be a point of weakness or a point of strength. We've seen this with the Eurocoba pipeline in the USA, which was a victim of a cyber attack, and we saw a similar incident in Texas. Infrastructures play a very important role to improve the resilience of our economies. If we look at the French landscape, if we look at the infrastructures from the types of use, an activator and accelerator of transition and contribution to the resilience of the economy, I would say there are 3 types of infrastructure. You have zones of strength, zones of weakness of the infrastructures today, and the third category which is the challenges of the infrastructures of tomorrow. So if we're looking at the zones of strength, these are well known, but we have the example of a high quality electricity grid which meets the user's needs, which contributes to land use planning and development of the territory, and it gives enterprises access to high quality and relatively cheaper energy. We also have a very low carbon energy thanks to the nuclear power. Another example that comes to mind is the road network. 1 million square meters, a very good road network, both for private users and also for logistics who use it a great deal, and especially a lot of goods are carried on roads. If we're looking at the weaknesses of French infrastructures, what comes to mind there is the intermodal aspect. We have a very good rail network which gives great service to users, both private individuals and companies. For reasons due to historic choices made to put the emphasis on passenger transport rather than freight transport, this is a very important element if we want to reduce the carbon footprint of French companies, which is to develop the rail more. So to develop rail, we have to have these connection infrastructures, such as connections with ports and trains, which is in France is inferior to what we find in other countries. For example, German ports are very well connected, and this is not the case in French ports. If I now look at the major types of infrastructure where we need, these are infrastructures of the future, I would say, first of all, the first example would be the recharging infrastructures for electric vehicles. As you may know, France is aiming to have 10 million electric vehicles by 2030. This means 1 million charging points. At the moment, we only have 30,000. So we need to develop a new type of infrastructure, a charging infrastructure. And my colleague from BCG published a study saying that we needed about 30 million tons of CO2 would be saved every year if this infrastructure was put in place to have a greener mobility. Another example, we talk a lot about green hydrogen at the moment. If you have massive quantities of electrolyzers to produce hydrogen, this can be done. And after that, then you have green electricity to support that. I would conclude so that the positive point is that, as is in the news at the moment, there's a lot of investment in recovery plans, and a lot of in private funds are investing in transition as well. One of the reserves is that in France we only have 10 billion on infrastructure, so the success will depend on very good public sector collaboration. Thank you, David Parlong. Now we turn to Marie-Ange Thebon. Since last year, you have become the chairwoman of the Keolis Group board. Before that, the deputy director of Suez. I'd like to ask you a question which might seem simple. How do you think we can reconcile land use planning with the energy transition? Thank you, Anne. First of all, I think that if we refer to what David has just said, or Akiko, collective transport is not a white elephant at all. Public transport is the opposite of that. First of all, because in terms of the environment, it ticks all the boxes, or a lot of the boxes. Akiko was saying that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from transport. That's true. But 95% of that figure is road transport. If we look at the level of particles and greenhouse gases and all of the aspects that worry us about air pollution, most of this comes from road transport and diesel in particular. Collective public transport is the mobility infrastructure which ticks the box of energy transition. We have a ratio of 1 to 50 compared to private cars, if we're looking at trains or trams. And in some cases, the ratio can be 1 to 100 if we look at the kilometre per passenger. So clearly, in terms of energy transition, collective transport is a vital part of any solution. If we want to carry out this change that we all need to see, we need to invest more in collective transport. In terms of land use planning, I think this is the only solution which will enable us to avoid two obstacles: congestion and isolation, which will make it possible to overcome. We need to overcome this isolation. We will be able to reduce congestion, and the economists have been publishing figures published by the European Union last year. Congestion in Europe is the equivalent of the GDP of Portugal or the GDP of Greece in terms of lost time, collective malfunctioning. With collective transport, clearly you are attacking this congestion problem, which isn't a Parisian problem. It's a problem in Bordeaux, in Lyon, and many cities. And obviously, we'll talk about emerging countries. It's also an issue for emerging countries in cities like Dhaka, which have congestion as well. The question of breaking down isolation is also important. If we go back to the theme of financing, we can turn the thing the other way around. And the train is very important. There are only two ways of financing infrastructure, which is by price or by tax. So solidarity at one time or another, even if we put in structural financing with high-quality investors, at one time or another, if you put in debt and capital, one time or another you have to reimburse this. It can do this in two ways, either through the price of the service or through taxes. And then it's up to us collectively to decide what is the right proportion between the price which is paid by the user and the taxes which are paid collectively. So that's the question of how you finance infrastructure in France, and sometimes this is done collectively. This is not very clear in France. Thank you, Marie-Ange. Thank you for keeping to your time. I don't know, maybe we have Antonio Costa Silva. I hope you're connected. Good afternoon. You are joining us from Portugal. Antonio Costa Silva, you have several roles. You're president of the Management Commission of the Partex Oil and Gas Group. You're also chair of the National Portuguese Commission for Monitoring of the Recovery and Resilience Plan. And also you are professor at the Higher Superior Institute, Technical Institute of Lisbon. Because of these three roles, you have a very precise view of digitization of infrastructures. Could you tell us about the situation in Portugal and also around Europe concerning this aspect?
Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to share with you some ideas in this panel. I think the pandemic crisis has placed in front of us this huge challenge in terms of the future. We have to think in terms of infrastructure, not only on the physical infrastructures, but also on the digital infrastructure. There is a shift towards the intangible economy, and we have to place this in terms of our thinking. When we analyze the investments for the infrastructures in Portugal, there are several criteria. We have to consider the short term, but also the medium and long term. There are criteria in the investments related with the cost-benefit analysis. We have to be sure that the investments will be very productive in terms of the economic functioning of the country, but also they have to be aligned with the decarbonization efforts. They have to be aligned with the territorial cohesion of the country, and they have to be aligned with the competitiveness that the country has to be enhanced for the future. And we can give you some examples. For instance, the national railway network, the electrical network, will be crucial to link all the capitals of district, to complete all the system, link also to Spain. And this is very important to develop the interior of the country, the territories of lower density, and to increase the enhancement and competitiveness of these areas of the country. On the other side, we have the ports, and the ports, they are under a modernization cycle, linking also to the energy transition. So in Sines, which is the deepest water port that we have in Portugal and one of the deepest water in Europe, it is a very important asset. So it will be linked to an investment on hydrogen. Hydrogen, I think, will be a competitor for the electrical vehicles as well in terms of mobility. Hydrogen is very versatile, so it can play a role also in terms of the fuels for the maritime transport, and it is aligned also with the energy transition. But on top of that, in Sines, we have some submarine cables developed by Google and other multinationals linking the country to the Cape Town. It is an 11,000 kilometers cable. There is another one linking to Brazil. And I think data and the data economy is at the center of the global trade in this center. There is an explosion in terms of cross-border data flows. They increased 112 times in the last 12 years. And data is not important for the trade, is also important for innovation. And this is related with your question and the issue that you have placed. We are adding a lot for the digitalization. So there is a study from McKinsey showing very clearly that this new mood of this new cycle of digital technologies can increase in terms that they can have the impact in terms of the economy that is 10 times larger compared with the Industrial Revolution, and the scale is 300 times more impressive. So it can change completely the companies, the public sector, the private sector, and there is a huge effort in terms of this digitalization. I think if we place this digitalization at the center of this revolution in terms of the economy. We will have a reconfiguration of the production chains. We will have a strong use of the electronic platforms for trade. We can develop a sort of micro multinational companies in the country that can compete at the worldwide basis using these electronic platforms. And it is impressive because the e-commerce hit just 25.6 trillion US dollars last year. It is growing, and I think the cyberspace will reorganize the economy. It will duplicate the economy and brings new ways to develop the countries for the future.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Ancodia Costa, Silva. Pour continuer notre...
To continue our roundtable, I'll turn to Thierry Dio. In 2005, you founded the Meridian investment group. You've invested in many different places, in the US, in Turkey, and Europe, of course, and in Africa. And in France, we've heard a lot about your group recently because of your participation in purchasing Suez. I'd like to ask you, because of this central role, if you could tell us something about the public-private partnerships that are at the heart of development of infrastructures over the last few years. Is it still working just as well? Or is it perhaps a promising avenue for the future? Perhaps to talk more about public-private partnerships and talk about the contribution that is to be identified and to build and construct the infrastructures of tomorrow. First of all, for me, the priority infrastructures for tomorrow are those that meet our objectives for 2030 for sustainable development. This is a low-carbon economy. All of the infrastructures capable of bringing us towards this net zero economy and to meet the social and societal needs that are defined in the Paris Agreement for 2030 are the priority infrastructures. We're talking about mobility. Marie-Ange has already mentioned that. We're also talking about energy transition and resources, in this case water, since you've mentioned it, and also energy. We're also talking about essential social infrastructures, such as healthcare, education, and also digital, which has become an essential subject for our societies. The public-private partnership, I think we can look at them at several levels. It can't be just reduced to one form of contractual structure with concessionary systems or a partnership contract. It can be looked at being of three types. The first level is the investment policies, where choices are made, and since we're talking about recovery plans, this is where the public funds will be focused on infrastructures which have the most impact to meet the objectives I've just mentioned. And in that sense, it's important, I think, in France and Europe, we have some very good practice for public consultation to make these choices, and that's very important because this is how you can avoid these white elephants. There is no point in making hasty decisions to build a motorway or a roundabout if eventually the users will not need it or there won't be any customers for an infrastructure, and that's very important. So it's important to, very early on in the project, to include a dialogue between three players, the stakeholders and the users and the builders of the infrastructure. Even if you're talking about the hospital, the private sector and the public sector. The second point, which is the most important, is what I call the infrastructure factory. The infrastructures start with a project, they become something that private investors can invest in. That's why we need to have a public-private dialogue, and then we have contractual forms of public-private partnership which are essential. To take one example, we had 3 American recovery plans since 2008 of more than $1 trillion. For the time being, we haven't seen anything. So you shouldn't be too enthusiastic about the publication of figures. But it's also the same is true in France as well. It's not just because we announce hundreds of billions of dollars or euros that they're actually going to be used. So the manufacturing, the production process is important. For that, you need to have skills. You have to have human capital, which is quite rare within the private sector and also within the public sector. And this combination of the two in various different contractual frameworks to produce these infrastructures and to prepare them. Let me take two concrete examples. What we've been able to do with the Hauts-de-France region in France to produce the Port of Calais, which was a project which for 15 years was in limbo, and we were able to get it up and running and to design it first of all and to adapt it to its correct business model, because it's an important link between France and England, and also to find the financing, including European financing. And that's how the region and ourselves were able to produce this project. The second, which is very to myself and Marie-Ange, because we've been fighting for a year for Dakar to have its own electric bus network. It's important to see how you can have a marriage between the public and private sector. And the third point, to keep to my time, is the subject of the quality of the infrastructures, where a long-term commitment by the private sector, not only to the financing, but also to operation and production, can make it possible to have a guarantee of the quality of service and also to adapt it to climate change.
Thank you. Thierry talked about the making of infrastructure. With you, we'll talk about the infrastructures that exist. Since 2016, you're the general manager of Socotec, an international company specialized in consultancy in the mastering of risk in the construction and infrastructure. Thanks to this inspection mission, you have a unique view on the French infrastructure. What's the state of the French infrastructure in general? Thank you. And before taking the presidency, I was the leader of Norbert d'Entresang, so I was an expert in the road systems. I think there's a limit to railroad transport for freight, but anyway. If I go back on your question, I will react on a few comments that were made. In your Socotec is 9,000 employees. Infrastructure represents 1/3 of our activity. So we have elements of comparison between France, Great Britain, the US, and Germany, which are our major clients. And the criteria that are set forth by David, there were 3 criteria. First of all, resilience. I think that developed countries are not making progress on resilience, and France in particular. I will not try to reach a consensus. I think there's a decline in terms of resilience of our infrastructure in France, which was a strong point in the past. I share what you said about the electrical network and the highway network, but we're in a kind of a period of decline because I don't think we made good choices between 2 models. The model that was designed with a lot of creativity by the British in the 90s, which is a model of outsourcing, of strong delegation with a regulatory authority with a lot of power, and what we call the German model, which is rather integrated with the Stadtwerke, that is the municipal business enterprises that give that have a lot of operational competencies. And what makes me say that is that in the end, different from the building industry, when you talk to the real estate sector, it has a good idea of its what it has. It knows what it invests in maintenance and what the assets are worth. I'm surprised to see that for infrastructure, nobody knows what our infrastructure is worth. Technically, of course, besides the use that we make of them, but nobody traces the maintenance that is done on infrastructure, the consequence of which is that you have quick reactions. Maybe you just saw a report that was surprising, a parliamentary report. 10% of French bridges, 25,000 bridges besides railroad bridges which are considered at risk. There was the disaster of the Normandy Bridge, but we have 10% bridges which are at risk. It may sound weird, but is the consequence of something that wasn't traced well enough, and to react on who pays, because in the end it's the tariff or taxes. But I think we can invest more, not as strongly, by being much more rigorous on the state of the asset, and by having a public authority, even though it doesn't have operational competency, keeps the ownership and the management of the infrastructure much stronger than it has today. That should be the case. And whatever the model, whether it's a delegation or an integrated model, I think it's essential to have also an independent overview on the state of bridges and other similar infrastructure. The operator in the disaster did the inspections, so he had falsified some results of inspections. But if you go back to basic principles, the fact of having in the hands of the same actor the role of operator and the role of inspector or technical inspector, highly technical with testing systems, it is not a virtuous system, whether for secure or safety, the safety of users, because that's what, in the end, that's what it boils down to, then for the sobriety with a view to the maintenance policies. So going back to your point on resilience, I think France has stepped backward in terms of the resilience of its infrastructure. So this is a serious matter. Thank you, all of you, the 5 of you, Akiko. So we have a little more than 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So would be interested in using the internet or in the room if you want to participate, if you agree. But do you want to react maybe? Or otherwise, if you don't have any comments to make, we can take the questions. Just one reaction to say that the Cercle des Économistes was very subtle by bringing us together, because you have an ecosystem of what makes the success of an infrastructure. So you need to have an intelligent definition of the need, structure the financing, bring in partners, exploit and operate the infrastructure, and in the end you have to have an outside look to ensure the maintenance of the equipment. So we are a group representing everything you need to develop infrastructure. Sir, you had a question? There is a microphone. Yes. Mrs. Devon talked about 2 sources of financing: taxes or tariffs or public money. What are the Director General of the RATP was saying that the infrastructure of Line 14, which was developed in Saint-Ouen, increased the price of the real estate, and the RATP did not benefit from that. The third path, wouldn't it be a good idea to use the local real estate to generate money? And what are the alternatives besides taxes and real estate, for example? This is a question to Mrs. Devon, or go ahead. Yeah, we agree, but what you just described is it's taxes. It boils down to taxes. Taxes on a specific category of beneficiaries, but it's but in fact, public transport and for us, Keolis and the local authorities are financed by a mix of taxes, the mobility tax that weighs on businesses. And so the public transport brings to businesses and enterprises wherever they are in the cities the capacity to transport the competencies and taking them to work. The MEDEF says that we should reduce the mobility tax, but it's a tax that finances public transport. So we can imagine creating an additional source of income. For example, with the rise in the cost of real estate neighboring the transport service, what would be the tariff? Obviously, the user must have a good understanding of the service that is provided. It's this public bounds that you have to seek. but it's public policies. The public decision makers must have this alternative to work with. Akiko, I think you had a comment to make. It's true that the wisdom of the circle brought you together, but I was led to understand in what you said that there were a few problems of multimodality, intermodalities, so notably with the freight. Could you please comment on that, on the issues of multimodality? The road specialists always have problems with freight. You have to be realistic, and notably for freight. There is no miracle solution, but there are several mobility solutions to meet the needs of the freight. The real topic here is that in France we we prefer to propose railroad services to passengers rather than freight, and we never really addressed the idea of the carbon, the CO2 emissions for the transport of freight. And freight is part of our commitments and our objectives for sustainable development to curb CO2 emissions. I don't think solutions should not be brought in opposition. No, the railroad solutions don't work everywhere. I do freight transport in Calais to transport your containers, but it doesn't mean I will be able to capture all the traffic with road and railroad solutions. Solutions like the digital innovation, all possible imaginable innovations with a clear objective, which is the efficiency of logistics and the lowering of the carbon emissions. If I may say one thing, comment on what Thierry just said, and I will change roles. I don't have specific interest in lorry transport. But we also always have to keep in mind the three basic things. The explosion of internet consumption or consumerism calls for logistic flexibility that is unseen. And we were very happy to see that during the different confinements. But here as a citizen and consumer, we have very contradictory opinions. Life is a contradiction. We are contradictory in our expectations. It's why it needed. The first value of road transport is its flexibility. It's very flexible. It's an incredibly flexible sector with a view to the characteristics of what is a vehicle. So the idea here is to work on the carbon footprint, hydrogen transport as a solution. It's a real subject, but I'm ready to take a bet that in 20 years from now, the ratio road and railroad freight, I take a bet that it won't be very different in 20 years. So once this said, I think we have to accept our contradictions on the parcel at my doorstep, with all the flexibility this presupposes, with something with a green approach I want to see. Well, there are some alternatives to the thermal engines, but this idea of the explosion of volumes due to e-commerce, so this shows the limit of prospective reasoning. I was at the beginning of the e-commerce wave at the head of Norbert D'Entresang, and I'm sorry, but nobody had forecasted that. Nobody. And so what it means is that you have to be humble and pragmatic. I think that the infrastructure is based on the logic of offer. When you put pipelines in place, virtuous pipelines, you take along with you the economy. And that was your question. Line 14 has positive externalities on real estate, for example. Yes, obviously, that's obvious. But these subjects can be multiplied indefinitely. So speculative post-COVID reasonings, how the people will live, what will be their hopes and their needs. I think we have to take things carefully, work on what exists, and by increasing the number of pipelines and making them more virtuous with a view to the 2030 objectives. We have one online question. anonymous question for the priorities of infrastructure. Should we define the priorities according to the available financing? So should we make an economic calculation? David, do you want to? I would say, no, it's a question for the budget office, but it's okay. With someone that comes from Bercy, I would say that by definition, when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about object, the externalities of which are not economical, and they don't benefit to the operator or the owner of the infrastructure. So by definition, to prioritize an infrastructure is never looking only at the economic approach. The question that comes after is when you want to have that financed by the private sector, and we need that given the constraint that weigh on the on public funding. How can the authorities send a signal? It could be tariffs, it could be subsidies, guarantees given to those who finance the operation. I think we can set priorities, and even if the field of investment is broad, we should have priorities. Recharge stations, hydrogen. We should prioritize with a view to the carbon footprint. You can look at weaknesses in the resilience of our economies. It's in those infrastructure that we need to invest. There are examples. Europe is working the implementation of the infrastructures producing vaccines. It's another way of seeing things. Here again, it's a way of giving a strong economic signal. Is the tariff that Europe will pay or the member states to hire, to rent this infrastructure? And I think that on all criteria, resilience, what is important to accelerate the digital transition, environmental transition, we have objective criteria that are not only of economic basis on which we can prioritize. I would like to add one thing here. I don't know if the question was more of an economical or financial nature. There are economic externalities that can be positive for the community, and they are not only financial. It's important, if we talk about an impact on the infrastructure, it's important to position the financial aspects at the same level as non-financial externalities. And that is of importance because if we only take the financial equation to make our choices in infrastructure, we'll have just nothing. But the impact it creates for the common good, for the economy at large, for employment, access to well-paid jobs, biodiversity, and so forth. These are criteria that are essential in the choice of the infrastructure because, in the end, we have a time that is counted, 2030, 2050. It's just tomorrow. Don't forget that. And to pull out of the financial aspect, the crisis has pushed forward the question of inequalities. And to what extent can infrastructure be a response to that? Marie-Ange is in the better position to answer this question. Well, it's true that at Keolis, operator of public transport, to give you examples of fighting against inequalities, when you live in Paris, you're not aware of the school transport. School transports were a big major operator of school transport. If the collective school transport did not exist, we'd have a problem to take our kids to school and the students at the university. Obviously, we play an important social role by providing this service. Now the people with reduced mobility were also a big operator for this. I'm talking about a fragile public. And beyond the fragile populations, which is something where collective transport is very important. You have the issue of the price of transport. Obviously, collective transport is an affordable transport. Even if you have a debate on tariffs, there are large varieties of tariffs, diversity of tariffs. We're the operators of the Lille metropolis. In Lille, there's about 50% of the users of the Lille metropolis who have a special rate or tariff. in a way or the other, either because they're over 65 or under 18, or covered by a social benefits. We have a capacity, thanks to collective transport, to offer a mobility service that is extremely, it reduces inequalities, and that's why it's part of the strengths and the fact that collective transport and the infrastructure of public transport are at the heart of the recovery. You know, we have 5 minutes now of questions. I don't want to frustrate anybody in the room. If you have an urgent question, please. So you talked about the state of bridges, in particular those who are problematic, with a reference to the Italian disaster. It was 10%. Do you have an idea of the evolution of this number? And how can we finance maintenance of an infrastructure that has nothing new but only consists in maintaining a service level? It's not really exciting, is it? It's not exciting, you're right. But it's very practical, highly concrete, and we're all concerned with that. The problem is to do an inventory, and it's a consequence of decentralization where the means did not follow. I had a few conversations with communities, and they said, "Oh, I prefer not to know rather than knowing and not having the means to do the job." So to make a positive note on the 9 or 10 billion allocated, there is part of this money will be dedicated to an inventory, knowing that some bridges are aging. They were designed for uses that are quite different from the traffic they carry today, and there's a bit of thermal stress that is added to the equation. So the first subject, what I fight for, it's an inventory to start with, so that we have a maintenance plan that follows. Knowing that what our models show, 1 year of postponed maintenance brings an overcost of 25% a year after. So rationally speaking, if we talk about the economy, it's the old saying of our grandmothers that don't postpone to tomorrow what can be done today. Is particularly true in the field of buildings and infrastructure. And I would say the virtue, what's happening now is that in a confused manner, but spectacular manner, things that were perceived as meant to last eternally, they don't. And there's a wake-up call to say, yes, but our infrastructure, including the most basic, must be resilient. That's the least we owe to the users. And it seems that the awareness is there, the means follow, the systemic response for me is in stronger decentralization. I'm sorry. Taxes, yeah, public money. The solution is public money. The users, pay in highways, the pay tolls and everything. So, but the owner of the bridge must take care of the safety, because it's an issue. It's a safety issue. It's a life or death. Here it's not just thinking it's fun to fix bridges, but because when it collapses with cars on it, there'll be nobody to answer. That's what happened in Italy. So the responsibility of the owner of the equipment, when it's private, it's in a concession, and maybe not in Italy, but I think in France, when there's a concession, the company is responsible. So not to conclude on those dramatic issue of bridges, we had talked to each of our panelists with Akiko to imagine an ideal world for tomorrow in terms of infrastructure. And maybe we could ask Antonio Costa Silva. You're still with us? Oh, thank you for your patience. So Antonio, for you have a minute each, the panelists. What is your ideal world in the next 10, 15 years? What does it look like?
I think the ideal world, if you look to the trends today, we will have in the future a huge development in terms of the cities. We have been discussed about mobility, but the landscape of the cities has to be changed, because in the cities the consumption of energy is 75%. and they are responsible for 80% of the emissions of CO2. So there is no targets for the Paris Agreement if we don't change this landscape. And the change is based on the sensors that will be placed in the cities, the treatment of information, the ability to regulate the flow of people, vehicles, water, resources, energy, residuals. So this will be a key issue. And the other one is related with the Internet of the Things. We will have a sort of galaxy of equipments that are communicating, an electronic galaxy with all the machines communicating with each other, linked to the big data, linking to the development of the power computing and the cloud, and this will change dramatically the economy. We will gain efficiency, we will gain scale, maybe we'll decrease our footprint, and I think technology, science and knowledge will shape the future of our civilization.
Merci Antonio. Magnifique. Hervé, je ne sais pas si vous voulez prendre la suite. Votre monde idéal.
Do you want to take the floor? Yes, I think that it revolves around two elements. Infrastructure, it's a state subject, it's up to the state. So an ideal world would be a state that would take the responsibility under the angle of the human assets when it comes to managing infrastructure. And the second thing to be in line was that there were a lot of solutions that would come from the Internet of Objects. My angle is an angle as an operator, and in the angle of resilience to enable much safer monitoring and more sober maintenance work around our infrastructure, knowing that I think that the human race is such that mobility is an incompressible desire, which is at the heart of human life and the economy. So I think, I think we need to be able to face this demand while being in line with the objectives of 2030 in terms of sustainable development. Thank you, Marie-Ange. 1 minute each, otherwise David won't have time, so I'd like to respond on the angle of transport. I would to re-enchant the public transports. You know, when you board a public transport bus, you're happy. It's a moment of pleasure. You're happy because it's on time, because you have all the information you need. It's comfortable. You have room, and there's a very good coordination with all the other transport modes and soft mobility, walking, cycling. Perfect world. That would be the perfect world. I think that investments in infrastructure in the long run, in the long term, should take us to a world that's at 1.5 degrees, an inclusive world, whether in our own society, but also with the countries of the South. David? Well, in terms of infrastructure, my world is a world where you broaden the scope of infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, you talk, of course, the network of electrolyzers, you talk about shared vaccination production capacities, pickup points for e-commerce in the cities. And why I think it's the ideal world, because it would mean that the economic actors will have found other common places in the functioning in the economy, places that they would like to share and that serve a multiplicity of actors. That would be an ideal world. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you to the five of you for those nice perspectives. Namekiko, I think you have the last words, if you want. Re-enchant the world with intelligent civil servants. I think, okay, we'll try. Thank you.